Multiple regions of stable crops, all failing worldwide simultaneously, was once a hypothesis or the stuff of science fiction movies. Now that has all changed in recent years. Now, researchers are reassessing the new weather and temperature data points, the anomalies that are becoming the norm, and encouraging people to revise their estimates to a high probability of these crop failures happening before we even get out of this decade. If you've been following the news, we're already seeing this playing out in real time around the world. Factors like droughts, heat waves, floods, pests, and global events like wars and trade conflicts disrupt crop production and strain the already strained food supply chain. 72% of stable crops are grown in just 5 countries. Now, these regions with favorable climates, they've been supporting the global agricultural supplies for centuries, but that's beginning to change. Scientists estimate that by 2050, we could see rice or wheat failures every other year, with soybean and maize failures even more frequently. And with the recent anomalies and record temperatures that we're already seeing this year, the evidence points to the probability of synchronous crop failures from occurring by mid-century to this very decade. In this video, I'm going to help you understand how these crop failures will impact you, but more importantly, I'll tell you the real simple solutions that you can plug in today to lessen the impact of these crop failures in the future. There's a lot to unpack here, so let's jump in. Synchronized crop failures. The term crop failure, it's often taken to mean a total failure, but it can also just be a much lower yield, low enough so as not to produce enough to support a community or provide a surplus to sell. Now, crops can fail due to drought, heat extremes, sudden cold, floods, or even pest infestations. Even with decent yields and harvests, war, economics, and trade conflicts, they can create barriers to accessing food sources. Now, the hoarding of grains by some countries can create scarcity and hunger in other countries. 72% of stable crops like maize, wheat, soybeans, and rice are grown in just 5 countries, in regions known as their breadbasket. Now, these regions, including North America's plains and India's and China's river valleys, they've supported centuries of agricultural due to their favorable climates. If one of these breadbasket areas suffered greatly in the past, another could just simply pick up the slack. And as weather patterns tilted to the more extreme starting out at the turn of this century, scientists have begun to explore the possibility of multiple areas having failing crops simultaneously. Trends in weather patterns and rising temperatures in recent decades have already led researchers to conclude that numerous stable crop failures worldwide could occur at 25 times the current rates by 2050, less than 30 years from now. And the recent shattering of temperature records and weather anomalies occurring daily worldwide have reignited this conversation and study. Now, many scientists call for revising that 3-decade time frame to possibly within this decade. And this should be a significant concern for anyone not wholly growing their own food and raising their own livestock. We're at the mercy of a system that is likely to decline or completely fail within the coming years. Now, imagine for a moment that several rice-growing regions worldwide suddenly have dramatic weather extremes, leading to synchronous harvest failures. And we've already seen that beginning in recent years, with extreme heat and drought impacting some areas and torrential downpours and flooding destroying other regions. It's estimated that around half of the people in the world get around 50% of their calories from rice alone. Now, most of these crop-dependent people cannot simply just pivot to corn, wheat, or soybeans. Many of the countries where these people live can't suddenly compete for expensive alternatives because as the supply of rice drops, the price of other options skyrockets. Now, regardless of the causes, rising global temperatures fuel more intense extreme weather events, such as heat waves, droughts, floods, wildfires, and storms, all of which adversely affect food production worldwide. When the newly collected recent temperature and weather data was put into the same studies of potential synchronous failures conducted over the last 50 years, scientists realized that it was time to revise their 2050 estimates. A University of Leeds study in 2014 discovered that the impacts on global crop yields would start to rise to the level of extreme significance as early as 2030, just 7 years from now. Now, these synchronous crop failures by 2050 didn't go away with this need to revise down their occurrence. On the contrary, the certainty of them by mid-century increased even as the likelihood it would occur sooner increase. And by the middle of this century, there could be a possibility of rice or wheat failure occurring every other year, and the likelihood of soybean and maize failures even might be higher. However, before we get to that point, we're going to ramp up to it with multiple smaller failures that could dramatically alter the world. And it's not just the weather, too. Access to fertilizers and pesticides, monocropping, and poor water management have all become a genuine threat to global food supplies as wars rage, natural gas used to make fertilizers and other resources are challenged, industrial farming and growing populations all threaten previously high levels of production. Understand that the very best of our modern science can't keep up with the speed of change here. Extreme weather is becoming more of the norm than the occasional anomaly. Overnight, we're not going to just be able to easily and quickly genetically modify a strain of maize that can withstand droughts and extreme heat. Even if we did, that seed is no guarantee against a sudden frost or torrential rain the following year. Ask any farmer. Planting any crop is a gamble against the weather and climate conditions that will be experienced that growing season. Worldwide, based on the data and feedback from the scientific community, crop failures may occur within a decade at a level sufficient enough to challenge food supply, food security, and global stability at severe levels. The answer to when we will see synchronous low-yield harvest is sooner, not later. Let me repeat that. According to the data and the trajectory that we're currently following, these synchronous low-level harvests may occur sooner than later. It will happen, and it's going to happen in our lifetime. The impact of these failures on our food supply will vary based on individual, economy, and location. Assessing your food supply chain resilience. The impact of synchronized crop failures on your food supply where you live comes down to three factors: socioeconomic access to food, biophysical capacity, and production diversity. Now, these factors determine whether you simply pass on having corn as a side dish because of a crop failure, pivot to some rice, or go hungry. Now, by assessing your placement with these three factors, you can determine at what level you will suffer from global synchronous crop failures. Let's briefly look at each as it relates to your food supply chain. Socioeconomic access to food. Socioeconomics are personal, regional, and national. It essentially means whether or not you, your area, and your country have the financial resources to acquire and maintain a supply of the resource, which is food in this case. Now, socioeconomic access to food means that people can get the food they need by having enough money, access to stores, and support from their communities or governments. Now, if your country or community has stored reserves of food, resupply and distribution methods, and sufficient funds or goods of value to exchange for food from other countries, you may have more options than many people worldwide. You probably also have the ability to pivot to other food sources. If the corn crop fails, for example, as I mentioned earlier, you could pivot to rice, quinoa, or some other grain or pseudo-cereal grain. Even highly affluent nations are susceptible to food shortages when agriculture is a large-scale commercial enterprise. In these cases, food sources grown within your country can flow to the highest bidders in other countries, which can result in scarcity in your own country. We saw this recently with natural gas being exported to the highest bidder, which was Europe. Biophysical capacity. Biophysical capacity refers to the ecological factors affecting food production, things like soil fertility, water availability, weather, and ecosystem health. A food system with a solid biophysical capacity can better cope with environmental changes and disruptions. Robust biophysical capacity ensures steady food production by maintaining fertile soil, sufficient water, and diverse ecosystems. In contrast, weak biophysical capacity makes food systems vulnerable to scarcity due to degraded soil, depleted water resources, extreme weather events, and disrupted ecosystems. If the land set aside for agricultural operations is insufficient to sustain the population, the country has to turn to other countries with greater biophysical capacity. Where you live is also susceptible to the biophysical capacity factor. For example, if you live far from usable agricultural land and the people in your general area don't have sufficient area for a garden, or your area's weather wouldn't allow you to grow anything, you have a negative biophysical capacity. Basically, you can't produce the food that you need to sustain your community within the confines of your community. Production diversity. Production diversity is essential for enhancing food supply chain resilience, especially in the face of worldwide synchronous crop failures. It involves cultivating a wide range of food crops and raising diverse livestock within a region or country. By having multiple types of crops and livestock, the food system becomes less vulnerable to the total failure of any single crop or species due to factors like disease outbreaks, extreme weather changes, or other disruptions. Now, this diversity acts as a buffer, ensuring that even if some crops fail, others can still thrive, reducing the risk of widespread food shortages and maintaining a more stable and secure food supply chain. You can look at these 3 factors through a map food production page that I'm going to link to in the comments and description section below. Basically, if you look at a food, let's take an example of lentils. You could see Canada produces millions of tons of it, primarily to export it worldwide to countries that produce very little of these. So Canada, however, does not really grow any of their rice because their climate's just too cold. Now the country must import 370,000 metric tons of this grain to its population because that's how much they consume annually. So Canada exports lentils and imports rice. Now, if rice crops fell in other countries, Canada might have to turn to its own lentils to eat. If lentils fell, many less affluent countries which depend on the imported food source are suddenly going to experience famine. This is true right now for the wheat from Ukraine and Russia. Combined, it is around 13% of the global wheat supply, but much of it flows to more impoverished nations that lack the means to pay for grain from other countries. And when the Ukrainian and Russian grain supply is challenged or disrupted, many nations are left with only the choice of going hungry. Understanding these 3 factors as they can impact your food supply is definitely from a macro perspective. There are many global factors like trade agreements, available land, levels of light, temperature, and precipitation favorable to growth. Still, you can use these 3 factors of socioeconomic access to food, biophysical capacity, and production diversity to really assess your exposure to multiple synchronous crop failures. Your solutions today. Accepting that the possibilities of these synchronous harvest failures occurring in the future being likely and understanding your exposure to them are the first steps in finding a solution for yourself. While it's a global problem that we have to face collectively, and the dearth of supply of any one stable crop will strain all other stable crops, there are individual solutions that you can plug in today. The first solution is to assess your exposure by understanding your consumption. While the worldwide average annual rice consumption per person is 148 pounds, you might not eat that much rice at all, or very rarely. You might just as well eat lentils on a regular basis or not at all. You might love a fresh loaf of wheat bread with every meal or no bread at all. Understand what you consume at home and what you consume of these staple grains when you get a deli sandwich, bowl of oatmeal, or tabbouleh salad. That hamburger as well is only available to you because, guess what? We feed it grain. Not intended for human consumption, it was fed to cattle. And once you understand your communities and your country's rate of consumption, there are solutions that you can begin to plug in to prepare for yourself for these particular scenarios. You can't really alter the inevitable, but you can still do a few things. First, you can bring your stored food to a level adequate to keep you in the critical grains that you eat for a year's time. For example, 1 5-gallon bucket of properly sealed and preserved rice will be almost 34 pounds. And at today's prices, that's around $40. Depending upon the variety and mill, that can equal 170 cups of cooked rice. That would definitely get me probably through a year. It would certainly carry me through a year of harvest disruptions until a better harvest restores global equilibrium. First is understanding your consumption. All right. Second is your storage levels in your preps. Third is your ability to pivot. And that comes down to what alternatives that you have in place. If you have a 3-month or a year supply of wheat, berries, rice, and corn all set aside in your long-term storage, you likely wouldn't feel the impact of synchronous crop failures unless they occurred in back-to-back years. If you also have lentils, quinoa, and oats set aside, you have even more options to pivot to when worldwide crops dive. And the fourth solution is to develop other food sources, preferably closer to home. Part of that is just understanding what other grains are available to you. A good starting point would be watching our video, 21 Overlooked Grains That Will Keep You Alive. There you will find many other food sources that you can pivot to in times of crisis, but you can also start incorporating them into your diet today in anticipation of these global shortages of some of our staple grains. When there is a run on rice or wheat at the store because of some of the news about global crop failures, I guarantee you that you will be able to find amaranth or quinoa. And even if you don't eat these grains, understand that these crop failures will have repercussions across the food supply. Meat prices will skyrocket. Even bean prices will go up as people scramble to find alternatives, which you hopefully already have. Are there local sources for other foods to bolster your inventory of all foods? Do you have any gardening connections? Or is there a boutique farm or ranch in your area? Is there a community garden that you could start or be a part of? Are there food pantries or unharvested fruit or nut trees in your area? My encouragement to you is this: lessen your dependence on global food supply lines by getting a local. And when it comes to getting local, try foraging or growing your own. I'm not suggesting you grow and process your own field of oats unless that's something that you have the capability of doing, but planting a patch of amaranth could easily supply you with the pseudo cereal year after year. Likewise, knowing what you can forage for in your area is a huge advantage. Take a page from your ancestors and make a buckwheat sorghum or curly dock bread with grains that you foraged from the wild. You will pick up vital nutrients missing from a modern diet and learn critical survival skills in the process. Finally, and I stress this a lot on this channel, grow something of what you eat and learn to cook it. You will offset the expense of food, increase your nutrition, and gain vital survival skills. That can be as simple as a windowsill garden, something more extensive like a small garden, or as elaborate as an indoor grow room or a greenhouse, but start growing something today. If you know how to and you're willing to grow potatoes, and you watched our video on making potato bread, it won't matter to you as much when wheat harvest fell. So, your solutions to plug in today for the inevitable synchronous crop failures that we will face in the coming years is to understand your consumption, raise your storage levels, understand what you can pivot to, get local, produce or forage for something of what you eat, and learn to cook it. I'll be honest with you. The science is getting more precise by the day, and we can't stop synchronous crop failures, but we can plug in solutions to lessen their impact on our future food supply. I always enjoy your feedback, your comments, your questions, so please feel free to post those below. As always, stay safe out there.